June 14, 1942. 18 miles southwest of Tobruk, Libya. The sun hangs like a copper disk in the bleached North African sky, and Sergeant Major William Bill Hawkins of the 7th Armored Division can taste the dust in his teeth. It coats everything: his uniform, his skin, the inside of his nose. The Western Desert has a way of getting into a man, of grinding him down particle by particle until is nothing but grit and stubbornness held together by discipline. Hawkins squints through the shimmering heat haze at the Italian positions roughly 800 yards to the east. The Ariete Division, dug in behind a low ridge of rock and sand. They've been trading fire for the better part of 3 hours, a desultory exchange of artillery and small arms that's accomplished precisely nothing except to make everyone thirstier and more miserable. His Crusader tank, Empress of India, sits hull down behind a formation of limestone outcroppings, its 2-pounder gun trained on the Italian line. Inside the tank, the temperature must be north of 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Hawkins knows this because he's spent enough time in these steel coffins to recognize the stages of heat. First comes the sweat. Then the sweat stops, which is when you need to worry. Then comes the muzzy thinking, the mistakes, the deaths. "Sir," calls out Trooper James Aldridge, his gunner, his freckled face slick with perspiration and oil. "Permission to brew up." Hawkins checks his watch. A battered Omega that belonged to his father in the last war. 4 p.m. hours precisely. Right on schedule, Aldridge. Light the BV. To anyone not intimately familiar with the British Army, what happens next would seem like a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by heat stroke and combat fatigue. Aldridge reaches to the rear of the turret where a peculiar piece of equipment is bolted to the hull, a cylindrical metal container about the size of a large thermos, with a heating element powered directly from the tank's electrical system. The boiling vessel. The BV. One of the British Army's most ingenious and most mocked inventions. Within minutes, water is bubbling. Aldridge drops in a handful of tea leaves from a tin marked property of HM Forces, adds tinned milk and sugar, and soon the interior of the Crusader fills with a smell that is utterly incongruous with mechanized warfare, the homey, civilized aroma of proper English breakfast tea. "Tea's up, sir," Aldridge announces with the formality of a butler in a Mayfair townhouse, not a gunner in a tank that's been under intermittent fire for most of the afternoon. Hawkins accepts a tin mug, careful not to spill it as another Italian shell whistles overhead and detonates somewhere behind them, showering their position with sand and rock fragments. He doesn't flinch. Neither does Aldridge, who's already pouring for the driver, Corporal Evan Davies, and the loader, Trooper Michael Mick Sullivan. Through his field glasses, Hawkins watches the Italian positions. He can see movement along their line, figures shifting behind cover. He wonders, not for the first time, what they must think of all this. 800 yards away, Tenente Giacomo Marchetti of the 132nd Armored Regiment lowers his own binoculars and turns to his gunner with an expression of complete bewilderment. "They've stopped shooting," he says in Italian, his voice carrying the incredulous tone of a man who no longer trusts his own senses. "Who has stopped shooting, Tenente?" asks Sergeante Paolo Rossi, wiping grime from his face. "The British. All of them. Look, their infantry in the Wadi, their tanks, everything. They've just stopped." Rossi peers through the vision slit of their M1340 medium tank. It's true. The British positions, which minutes ago were maintaining a steady harassment fire, have gone quiet. Not the quiet of preparation for an attack. Rossi has been in enough fights to recognize that particular silence, charged with violence about to explode. This is different. This is the quiet of men who have simply decided to stop fighting for a while. "Perhaps they're out of ammunition," suggests Caporale Antonio Greco, the loader, hopefully. "No," Marchetti says slowly, still watching through his binoculars. "No, they're Madonna Santissima, they're making tea." "They are what?" "Look at that tank, the one behind the rocks shaped like a camel's hump. You can see smoke from its engine deck. But not battle-damage smoke, cooking smoke." Rossi looks. It takes him a moment to process what he's seeing. The British tank, clearly visible in the harsh afternoon light, has several crew members sitting on its hull or standing beside it. One of them is definitely holding something, a cup. A mug. They're not in fighting positions. They're not scanning for targets. They're having a conversation, casual as you please, while one of them pours from what looks like a kettle. "They cannot be making tea," Rossi says flatly. "We are in the middle of a battle." "Are we, though?" Marchetti waves a hand at the eerily quiet battlefield. "Because it appears the British have decided we are not." This isn't the first time Marchetti has witnessed this particular British eccentricity. 3 weeks ago, during a running skirmish near Gazala, his unit had the British pinned down in a wadi. They were preparing a flanking maneuver when everything just stopped. For 20 minutes, the British held their position, didn't return fire, didn't attempt to withdraw. When Marchetti's unit finally advanced, expecting to find dead or wounded men, they instead found empty positions and recently extinguished cooking fires. The British had used the lull to brew tea and then withdrew in good order. "It's like fighting a nation of madmen," Greco mutters. "Who stops for tea in the middle of combat?" "The British, apparently," Marchetti replies. He's trying to decide whether to take advantage of this lull to fire on the exposed enemy. But something stays his hand. An instinct, perhaps. Or maybe just the sheer absurdity of the situation has paralyzed his tactical judgment. From the turret of the command tank, 50 meters to Marchetti's left, Captain Vittorio Benedetti has also noticed the cessation of hostilities. His voice crackles over the radio. "All units, hold fire. Repeat, hold fire. Observe enemy positions but do not engage unless they resume firing first." Marchetti understands the order. It's both practical and surreal. Practical because ammunition is always in short supply, and there's no point wasting it on an enemy who isn't currently shooting at you. Surreal because the reason the enemy isn't shooting is that they're having tea. Back in the Empress of India, Sergeant Major Hawkins drains his mug and sets it carefully in the rack welded to the turret wall specifically for this purpose. Every British tank in North Africa has these racks. Some tankers have brought china cups from home, unwilling to drink their tea from tin like savages. Hawkins thinks this is going too far, but he doesn't fault the impulse. When everything else about your existence is brutal, uncomfortable, and potentially lethal, you hold on to civilization where you can find it. "Feeling better, lads?" he asks his crew. "Much better, sir," Davies replies. The Welshman's voice has lost the ragged edge it was acquiring. The tea has done what tea always does, restored a sense of normalcy, reminded them that they're not just cogs in a machine of war but men with lives and memories and futures to return to. Right then. Hawkins checks his watch again. 16 minutes since they stopped firing. About standard for a proper brew-up. Back to work. The turret traverses with a mechanical whine. Aldridge settles back into his gunner's seat, eye to the sight. Sullivan loads a fresh round. Davies revs the engine, ready to move if needed. The Empress of India returns to the business of war as if the tea break were the most natural thing in the world. Which, to the men of the 7th Armored Division, it absolutely is. The practice of stopping for tea in the middle of combat operations isn't new to the North African campaign. It's been standard operating procedure in the British Army for as long as anyone can remember. But here, in the scorching vacuum of the Western Desert, it takes on an almost ritualistic significance. Tea isn't just a beverage, it's a marker of time, a measure of civilization, a connection to home. Every British soldier, sailor, and airman in the Mediterranean theatre receives a daily ration of tea as part of his basic supplies. It's considered as essential as ammunition, more essential than many other items. Quartermasters have been known to move heaven and earth to ensure tea reaches frontline units. There are documented cases of supply convoys under air attack prioritizing the tea cargo over other material. But the Real Revolution came with the boiling vessel, introduced to British armoured vehicles starting in 1942. Before the BV, tank crews had to dismount to brew tea, making themselves vulnerable to enemy fire. They'd light small fires using petrol-soaked sand, a dangerous practice that could reveal positions and occasionally resulted in burns or worse. The BV changed everything. Now crews could make tea without leaving their vehicles, maintaining security while attending to this most essential of needs. The installation of the BV in British tanks was taken seriously at the highest levels. Design specifications were drawn up at the War Office. Engineers tested various configurations. The final model could boil water in less than 10 minutes and was robust enough to withstand the punishment of combat operations. Some historians would later argue only half-jokingly that the boiling vessel contributed more to British tank crew effectiveness than any improvement to armor or firepower during the war. The German Afrika Korps finds the British tea obsession baffling but not particularly exploitable. German veterans of the North African campaign will later recount how they learned to recognize British tea breaks and sometimes use the lulls to attend to their own maintenance and rest. An unofficial understanding develops. When the British stop for tea, you don't shoot unless you want them to return the favor during your next meal break. The Italians, with their own strong coffee culture, are more perplexed than the Germans. Italian soldiers cannot understand why anyone would want hot beverages in the middle of the desert, where the ambient temperature already feels like being inside an oven. They drink water, wine when available, and save their espresso for more civilized settings. The sight of British soldiers contentedly sipping tea in 120-degree heat strikes many Italian troops as evidence of genuine insanity. But it's not insanity. It's psychology. Colonel Richard Dick O'Connor, commanding the Western Desert Force before his capture in 1941, understood this instinctively. He'd fought in the First World War, seen what happens to men when they lose their connection to normal life, when they begin to think of themselves as animals instead of human beings. The small rituals, tea, shaving, writing letters home, these are what keep soldiers functional over the long haul of a campaign. The North African campaign is testing this principle to its limits. The desert is a harsh mistress, offering none of the comforts of the European war. No villages to shelter in, no forests for cover, no civilians to remind you why you're fighting. Just sand, rock, heat during the day, cold at night, flies, scorpions, and an enemy who's as miserable as you are. In this environment, tea becomes more than a drink. It becomes a totem, a spell against madness, a 4 times daily reminder that you're British and the British do not abandon their standards just because conditions are difficult. The Germans respect this, in their way. British prisoners captured during Rommel's offensives report that their captors often comment on the tea drinking, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with a kind of grudging admiration. Here are men who will stop in the middle of a firefight to maintain a custom from peacetime. It speaks to either supreme confidence or supreme stubbornness, and both qualities are respected by professional soldiers. As afternoon bleeds into evening, the battle southwest of Tobruk sputters back to desultory life. Artillery exchanges resume. Tanks maneuver and countermaneuver in the endless game of position that characterizes desert warfare. But everyone knows that around 7 p.m. hours, things will pause again. The British will have their evening tea, and the Axis forces will attend to their own routines, and for a brief window, the war will observe an intermission. Sergeant Major Hawkins doesn't think about any of this in abstract terms. He's not a philosopher or a historian. He's a professional soldier doing a difficult job in a terrible place, and right now his job is to keep the Empress of India operational and his crew alive until someone figures out how to win this bloody campaign. The tea helps. That's all he needs to know. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and blood, he allows himself a moment of satisfaction. His crew performed well today. No one panicked. No one made mistakes. And they had their tea, on time, as prescribed by regulations and tradition. Tomorrow they'll do it all again. And the day after that. And the day after that, until either Rommel is beaten or they are. But through it all, there will be tea. Because that's what British soldiers do. April 3, 1941. Near Mersa Brega, Cyrenaica. 14 months earlier, before Sergeant Major Hawkins ever saw the Western Desert, Lieutenant Colonel Jock Campbell of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment was having what he would later describe as the most surreal conversation of his military career. He was standing in the command tent at divisional headquarters, still covered in dust from a reconnaissance patrol, listening to a supply officer explain why the latest shipment from Alexandria included 30 boiling vessel prototypes. Tea kettles, Campbell said, his Scottish accent thickening with disbelief. You're telling me that with Rommel breathing down our necks, someone in Cairo decided what we really need is tea kettles. Major Peter Vickers, the supply officer, didn't flinch. He'd been dealing with skeptical field commanders all week. Boiling vessels, sir. And yes, direct from the War Office via Middle East Command. They're to be installed in all armored vehicles beginning immediately. We need spare tracks. We need replacement engines. We need ammunition for the 2-pounders that actually works. Campbell ticked off items on his fingers. What we do not need is bloody tea kettles. With respect, sir, you do. Vickers pulled out a sheaf of papers, reports, studies, memoranda bearing the stamps of various military bureaucracies. Field studies from the Battle of France show that tank crews who can prepare hot beverages without dismounting maintain higher combat effectiveness over extended periods. They stay hydrated, their morale remains stable, and they're less likely to make tactical errors caused by fatigue. Campbell took the papers, skimmed them, his expression shifting from irritation to reluctant interest. The data was actually compelling. Tank crews equipped with internal heating elements for water reported 15% fewer heat casualties, 23% better sustained attention during long engagements, and significantly lower rates of what the reports euphemistically called operational exhaustion, which Campbell recognized as men simply giving up, mentally checking out because the conditions were too miserable to bear. And these boiling vessels, they actually work. Tested at Bovington, sir. 8 minutes to boiling water, powered directly from the vehicle's electrical system. No external fires, no dismounting required. The crews can brew up while maintaining combat readiness. Campbell looked at the device. Vickers had brought a cylindrical metal container with heating coils and a secure mounting bracket. It was heavier than he expected, solidly built, clearly designed by someone who understood that military equipment needed to survive rough handling. Fine, he said finally. We'll install them. But if the Germans break through because we were too busy having tea, I'm putting you in front of the court-martial. Vickers smiled. Sir, with respect, the Germans won't break through because we're having tea. That's rather the point. By June 1941, when Operation Battleaxe ground to a halt against Rommel's defences, nearly every British tank in North Africa was equipped with a boiling vessel. The innovation was already proving its worth in ways both measurable and intangible. Corporal Thomas "Tommy" Barrett of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment discovered the true value of the BV during a 3-day running battle near Capuzzo. His Matilda tank, Defiant, was part of a squadron tasked with holding a position against repeated German counterattacks. For 72 hours, they barely slept, taking turns on watch, firing until their barrels were too hot to touch, retreating and advancing in the endless churn of mechanized combat. What kept them functional, Barrett would later tell anyone who'd listen, was tea. Not the tea itself, though the hot liquid helped in the fierce desert heat, keeping them hydrated, giving them something warm in the frigid nights. But the ritual of it. The familiar motions, filling the vessel, switching it on, waiting for the water to boil. The smell filling the tank's interior. The moment when you wrapped your hands around a hot mug and felt like a human being instead of a machine component. It gave us something to look forward to, Barrett explained to a war correspondent who was collecting stories for the folks back home. 4 times a day, we knew we'd stop and have a proper brew. It broke the day into manageable pieces. You didn't think about surviving the whole battle. You just thought about making it to the next tea break. The correspondent, a woman named Margaret Birkwhite who'd seen combat in China and Spain, understood immediately. She'd watched soldiers develop all kinds of coping mechanisms. Some carried lucky charms. Some wrote obsessive letters. Some developed elaborate pre-combat rituals. The British had institutionalized their ritual, made it official policy, and equipped their forces accordingly. You're saying tea is a weapon, she said to Barrett. No, he replied, thinking carefully. Tea is what reminds you what you're fighting for. Civilization. Order. The things that separate us from the bloody chaos. If we can't stop for a proper cup of tea, what's the point of winning? Birkwhite wrote that down, word for word. The quote would appear in Life magazine 3 months later, accompanied by a photograph of Barrett and his crew having tea on the hull of Defiant, their faces streaked with oil and dust, mugs raised in a toast to the camera. The image would become one of the iconic photographs of the North African campaign. November 22, 1941. Outside Sidi Rezegh, Libya. The battle for Sidi Rezegh is a meat grinder, the largest tank battle fought in North Africa up to this point. British and German armor clash in a swirling, chaotic engagement that will last for days and cost both sides dearly. In the midst of this hell, Captain James Anson of the 5th Royal Tank Regiment finds himself in a situation that perfectly encapsulates the absurdity and importance of the British tea tradition. His squadron is surrounded. 6 Crusader tanks in a defensive circle, German forces on 3 sides, escape routes cut off. They've been in this position for 9 hours, fighting off probing attacks, taking casualties, running low on everything except determination and improbability. At 4 p.m. hours, Anson gives the order, "All tanks, brew up." His radio operator, Sergeant Douglas MacLeod, stares at him. "Sir, the Germans are literally 1,000 yards away." "Which is why we need tea, Sergeant. We're going to be here a while." MacLeod, who's been in the army long enough to know when an order is really an order, switches on the BV. Within minutes, the familiar smell fills their tank. Around the defensive circle, 5 other crews are doing the same thing. The Germans notice. Of course they do. Hauptmann Erwin Schroeder, commanding the reconnaissance elements of the 15th Panzer Division, watches through his field glasses as the encircled British tanks apparently stop fighting to what? He's not entirely sure until one of his men, a veteran tanker who'd fought in France, says, "They're making tea, sir." In the middle of a battle. It's what they do. Schroeder has fought the British before, at Halfire Pass and again at Capuzzo, but this is the first time he's witnessed the tea ritual up close. He's fascinated despite himself. These men are surrounded, outgunned, probably out of options, and they're having tea. It's either insanity or the most magnificent display of morale discipline he's ever witnessed. He decides not to attack during the tea break. Partly because his own tanks need maintenance and his crews need rest. Partly because he's curious what the British will do next. But also, he'll admit later, because there's something admirable about an enemy who maintains their rituals even in extremis. It speaks to a kind of courage that has nothing to do with firepower or tactical skill. Inside Anson's tank, the tea is having its intended effect. The crew's nerves, stretched wire-tight by hours of combat, begin to settle. Their hands stop shaking. Their voices lose the sharp edge of panic. They're still surrounded, still in mortal danger, but they're thinking clearly again. "Right," Anson says, draining his mug. "Here's what we're going to do." He outlines a plan, a coordinated breakout at dusk, using the low sun to blind the German gunners, concentrating their fire on the weakest point in the encirclement. It's desperate, but it's thought through, logical. 2 hours ago, Anson's mind was too frazzled to conceive this plan. The tea break gave him the mental space to think. At 1750 hours, just as the sun touches the horizon, the 6 Crusaders explode into motion. Engines roaring, guns firing, they punch through the German line. 2 tanks are knocked out immediately, their crews killed or captured. But 4 make it through, including Anson's, racing into the gathering darkness with German shells chasing them. When they reach British lines 40 minutes later, Anson's first order is to brew up. His crew, running on adrenaline and terror, need to come down, need to process what they've just survived. Tea will help with that. It always does. The Italian perspective on British tea drinking evolves as the campaign progresses. What initially seems like comedy gradually takes on a different character, something between respect and bewilderment. Sottotenente Carlo Benedetti, serving with the Trento Division, keeps a diary throughout his time in North Africa. His entries about the British tea ritual chart this evolution. June 15, 1941, the English stopped shooting at us today to drink tea. This is madness. How do they expect to win a war when they cannot even maintain focus for a full afternoon? August 3, 1941, we attacked a British position at dawn, hoping to catch them unprepared. They were prepared. They had sentries, fighting positions, ranged artillery. And they were having breakfast tea. I am beginning to think the tea is part of their preparation, not a distraction from it. October 19, 1941, our unit pinned down British infantry in a wadi for most of the day. They did not panic. They did not surrender. Every few hours they would stop returning fire, and we knew they were having tea. Then they would resume firing with renewed vigor. It is like fighting men who have rest periods built into their combat operations. January 4, 1942, a British prisoner, wounded but cheerful, explained to me about the boiling vessels in their tanks. They can make tea without leaving their vehicles. He spoke of this innovation with the same pride that German prisoners speak of their tank armor or our own men speak of Italian artillery. To the British, the ability to make tea in combat is a genuine military advancement. I am beginning to understand this logic. Benedetti survives the war and will later write a memoir of his North African service. An entire chapter is devoted to British tea, titled The Weapon I Never Understood Until It Was Too Late. In it, he argues that the British tea ritual was a form of psychological warfare, though not in any conventional sense. It wasn't designed to intimidate or confuse the enemy, though it did both. It was designed to sustain British morale over the long attrition of desert warfare, and in this it succeeded brilliantly. The Germans had better tanks, Benedetti writes. We Italians had more men. But the British had tea, and they had the discipline to stop and drink it even when stopping seemed like suicide. This gave them a resilience we could not match. We fought until we were exhausted, then we collapsed. They fought until tea time, restored themselves, and fought again. In the end, this made all the difference. March 15, 1942. Near El Agheila, Libya. Private Edwin Eddie Walsh, a 22-year-old loader with the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, is writing a letter home to his mother in Manchester. He's sitting on the hull of his tank, Britannia, using an ammunition crate as a desk. The sun is setting, painting the desert in improbable colors. His 4th of the day sits cooling beside him. Dear Mum, you asked in your last letter what it's like out here. The desert, I mean. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't seen it. Imagine everything brown. The ground, the sky, the air you breathe all brown with dust. It's hot enough to fry eggs on the tank armor during the day, cold enough to freeze water at night. There are flies everywhere. The food is terrible. We're always thirsty, always dirty, always tired. But we have tea. I know that sounds daft, putting it like that. But it matters, Mum. It matters more than I can properly explain. 4 times a day, we stop whatever we're doing, fighting, driving, maintenance, whatever, and we have tea. Proper tea, hot and sweet, just like at home. The armies even put special kettles in our tanks so we can make it without getting out, which is good because Jerry likes to shoot at people who get out of their tanks. The Italians think we're mad. Maybe we are. But that tea, Mum, it's a piece of home. When I'm drinking it, I'm not in the desert anymore. I'm back in our kitchen, listening to you and Dad talk about the neighbors and the weather. I remember that there's a world outside this sand and steel, a world where people have tea at regular times and everything makes sense. Captain Morrison says tea is good for morale. He's right, but it's more than that. It's a promise that we're going home. That we're not going to let this desert turn us into savages. That we're British, and the British drink tea, and no amount of Germans or Italians or bloody awful weather is going to change that. Walsh pauses, sips his tea, watches the sun complete its descent. In the distance, he can hear the rumble of vehicles, whether British or German. It's too far to tell. Tomorrow there will probably be another fight. More heat, more fear, more of his friends killed or wounded. But there will also be tea, 4 times, regular as clockwork. He finishes the letter, signs it with love, tucks it into an envelope. The mail transport comes through once a week, unreliable but persistent. His mother will get this letter in a month, maybe 2. She'll read it and probably shake her head at his going on about tea. But she'll understand, in her way. She's British too. Around him, the rest of Britannia's crew is settling in for the night. Guard rotations are established. Weapons are cleaned and checked. And tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock hours sharp, they'll have their first tea of the day. Because some things are too important to abandon, even in war. Especially in war. July 2nd, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. The retreat is over. After months of falling back across Libya and into Egypt, the British 8th Army has finally found ground it will defend. Here, at a small railway halt called El Alamein, between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression, there's no room left to retreat. This is where the line holds or the entire Middle East falls. Major Geoffrey "Jeff" Keating, serving as second-in-command of the 22nd Armoured Brigade, understands the stakes. So does every man in the 8th Army. They're digging in, laying minefields, positioning artillery, preparing for Rommel's inevitable assault. The work is exhausting, conducted under a merciless sun that seems determined to kill them before the Germans get the chance. At 10 o'clock hours, Keating orders a tea break. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Saunders, finds him 20 minutes later, standing beside a Grant tank with a mug in his hand, watching work parties drag another coil of barbed wire into position. Keating, Saunders says, "We have approximately 48 hours before Rommel attacks. Every minute counts." "Which is precisely why the men are having tea, sir," Keating replies calmly. "Push them too hard without breaks and they'll be useless when we need them most. Tea keeps them sharp." Saunders wants to argue. He's a driven man, energized by the crisis, running on pure adrenaline and coffee, but he's also been in the desert long enough to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion in his men: the glazed expressions, the clumsy movements, the short tempers. Keating's right. Damn him. The men need to rest, rehydrate, and recalibrate. 20 minutes, Saunders says. Then back to work. 15 minutes is standard for a brew-up, sir. But I'll pass the word. Throughout the British positions at El Alamein, similar scenes are playing out. Tank crews taking shelter in the shade of their vehicles, passing around mugs. Infantry in their slit trenches, heating water over small fires. Artillery crews, their guns already ranged and registered, sitting in whatever shade they can find with their tea ration. The psychological effect is immediate and measurable. The frantic, almost panicked energy that's been driving the retreat for weeks begins to ebb. Men remember their training, their discipline. They remember they're the 8th Army, not a mob fleeing in disorder. The tea break imposes structure on chaos, transforms frightened men back into soldiers. From German observation posts in the west, the pause is noted with interest. Lieutenant Klaus Weber of the Afrika Korps Intelligence Section watches British positions through powerful optics and documents what he sees in his log. 10-15 hours, enemy activity along defensive line decreases significantly. No evidence of withdrawal or repositioning. Appears to be organized rest period. 10-32 hours. Small fires visible at multiple positions. Consistent with meal preparation, though unusual for mid-morning. 10-48 hours. Activity resumes. Defensive preparations continue. Weber has seen this pattern before. The British and their tea. He includes a note in his report to division. Enemy morale appears stable despite recent defeats. Maintain organized routine including regular refreshment breaks. Recommend against attack during these periods as defending troops will be at their positions and alert. It's a small recommendation, easily overlooked. But some German officers read it and remember. In the grinding, attritional battles that will define the El Alamein campaign over the next 3 months, there will be times when German units pause their attacks, seemingly for no tactical reason. Often, these pauses will coincide with British tea times. An unspoken agreement, never acknowledged, never formalized, but real nonetheless. August 17, 1942. Alam el Halfa Ridge. Rommel's August offensive is failing. His panzers, pushed to their mechanical limits, are running out of fuel and ammunition. The British, forewarned by intelligence and prepared by General Montgomery's careful defensive planning, have held firm. Now it's the Germans who are retreating, and it's British units who are pressing them. Sergeant Arthur Archie Henderson of the 1st Armoured Division is pursuing elements of the 21st Panzer Division across broken ground south of the ridge. His squadron has been chasing these same German tanks for 6 hours, a running fight across miles of desert, and his crew is approaching the limits of endurance. At 4 p.m. hours, Henderson's radio crackles, all call signs, this is Sunray. Halt for replenishment. 30 minutes. The squadron grinds to a stop. Engines are cut. In the sudden silence, Henderson can hear his own heartbeat, feel the tremor in his hands that's part exhaustion, part adrenaline. His gunner, Lance Corporal Simon Briggs, looks like he might be sick. BV, Henderson orders simply. Briggs nods, reaches for the boiling vessel. His hands are shaking so badly it takes him 2 tries to switch it on. But once he does, once the familiar process begins, Henderson watches the man visibly steady. The ritual calming him, reminding his body that it's safe to stand down, if only for a few minutes. Sugar? Briggs asks, and his voice is almost normal. 3 lumps, Henderson replies. We've earned it. The tea, when it comes, is too hot and too sweet and absolutely perfect. Henderson drinks it slowly, feeling warmth spread through his chest, feeling his thoughts begin to order themselves again. They've been successful today. The Germans are pulling back. But tomorrow they'll have to do this all over again, and the day after that, until someone wins or everyone's dead. The tea helps him not think about that. It roots him in the present moment. Hot liquid, cooling desert air, the smell of engine oil and cordite, the knowledge that is alive right now, and that's enough. 200 yards away, the Germans they've been pursuing have also stopped. Through his binoculars, Henderson can see them dismounting, gathering in small groups. They're not preparing for combat. They're eating, resting, attending to their own needs. For this brief window, both sides have agreed without speaking that they're too exhausted to kill each other. Henderson finishes his tea, rinses his mug with a splash of water from his canteen, stows it carefully. In 15 minutes, they'll resume the chase. But for now, he's just a man having tea in the desert, and that's a kind of victory all by itself. September 4th, 1942. British 8th Army Headquarters, Burgh El Arab. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Freddie de Gingand, Chief of Staff to General Bernard Montgomery, is preparing a briefing on logistics for the coming offensive. Among the endless lists of supplies, ammunition, fuel, and spare parts is a line item that catches the eye of a visiting American observer, Colonel William Bill Darby of the U.S. Army Rangers. T. Darby reads aloud. £70,000. That's, what, 35 tons? Closer to 32, actually, de Gingand replies without looking up from his papers. And that's just for the initial assault. We'll need regular resupply after that. You're allocating cargo space for T. Darby's tone is carefully neutral, but his incredulity is obvious. During an offensive. De Gingand sets down his papers and looks at the American directly. Colonel Darby, let me explain something about the British Army. Our soldiers will fight without adequate food. They'll fight without proper sleep. They've fought without sufficient ammunition more times than I care to remember. But they will not fight without tea. Nor should they have to. It's a beverage. It's considerably more than that. It's a delivery system for morale, hydration, and routine. A British soldier who's had his tea is a soldier who's psychologically prepared for combat. A soldier who hasn't is a man questioning why he's risking his life in this godforsaken desert. Darby considers this. He's seen the British in action, noticed their apparent imperviousness to conditions that would break other armies. He's attributed it to training, discipline, that famous stiff upper lip. But maybe there's more to it. You're saying tea is a combat multiplier. I'm saying tea is essential. The boiling vessels in our tanks cost us valuable weight and electrical capacity. The tea ration takes up cargo space we could use for other supplies. But the return on investment is incalculable. Our tankers can spend weeks in continuous operations because they can maintain their routines inside their vehicles. Our infantry holds positions longer because they can look forward to their next brew-up. It's not about the beverage, Colonel. It's about preserving humanity in inhumane conditions. Darby makes notes. The U.S. Army is just beginning its own involvement in North Africa, preparing for Operation Torch. There are lessons to be learned from British experience, even if those lessons seem eccentric by American standards. Do you have data? He asks. Anything quantifying the effect? De Gingand pulls out another file. Medical reports show our heat casualty rates are significantly lower than German figures, despite operating in the same environment. Our combat stress cases, what they called shell shock in the last war, are also lower than expected. There are multiple factors, of course, but the routine of regular tea breaks is consistently cited by medical officers as a contributing factor to psychological resilience. The numbers are compelling. Darby, a pragmatist, can't argue with results. If tea keeps British soldiers fighting effectively, then tea is a legitimate military asset, however odd that seems to American sensibilities. We're planning to issue coffee to our troops, he says. Similar principle. Similar, but not identical. Coffee is a stimulant excellent for short-term alertness, but it can lead to crashes. Tea provides sustained energy without the same peaks and troughs. Also, the ritual matters. Coffee can be instant, grab and go. Proper tea requires time, attention, process. That process is half the value. Darby files this away. When American forces go into action in North Africa 2 months later, their ration packs will include instant coffee, but also instructions on the British practice of scheduled breaks for hot beverages. Some American units will adopt the practice enthusiastically. Others will ignore it. But the principle that maintaining peacetime routines in wartime has measurable combat benefits will become accepted doctrine. October 18, 1942. British positions at El Alamein, 10 days before the offensive. The 8th Army is ready. Months of preparation have transformed El Alamein from a desperate last stand into a fortress. Minefields stretch for miles. Artillery is massed in concentrations never before seen in North Africa. Fresh divisions have arrived from Britain and the Commonwealth. Everything is in place for Operation Lightfoot, Montgomery's carefully planned offensive to drive Rommel out of Egypt once and for all. Private Robert Bobby Shaw, a 19-year-old infantryman with the 51st Highland Division, is trying not to think about the coming battle. He's been in North Africa for 3 months, long enough to be considered experienced, not long enough to have lost his fear. Tonight, he's on guard duty, a 2-hour shift watching the western approaches for German patrols. At 10 p.m. hours, his relief arrives, Lance Corporal Donald Mackay, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Brought you a brew," Mackay says, settling into the slit trench beside Shaw. "Figured you could use it." Shaw accepts gratefully. The night is cold. Desert nights always are, and the hot tea is a blessing. They sit in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping their drinks, watching the darkness where the Germans wait. Thinking about the attack? Mackay asks eventually, trying not to. That's the trick, isn't it? Don't think about tomorrow. Don't think about what might happen. Just think about right now. Right now, we're having tea. That's not so bad. Shaw considers this. Mackay's right, in his way. This moment, isolated from past and future, isn't terrible. It's actually almost pleasant. Hot tea, cool air, stars overhead, a friend beside him. If he can string together enough of these moments, maybe he can survive what's coming. They say we're going to win, Shaw says. The officers, they're confident. Say we've got overwhelming force, perfect planning, everything going for us. Maybe so. But even if we win, lads are going to die. That's just the arithmetic of it. Mackay drains his mug, sets it aside carefully. My DA was in the last war, France and Flanders. He told me the secret to surviving wasn't bravery or luck or any of that. It was finding small things to care about. Small routines that reminded you who you were. For him, it was writing letters home every Sunday, no matter what. For us, it's tea. Just tea. Never just tea, Bobby. Tea is civilization. Tea is home. Tea is the promise that there's something better than this waiting for us when it's over. You hold on to that, and you can survive anything. Shaw wants to believe this. He's not sure he does, but he wants to. When Mackay leaves to complete his rounds, Shaw sits alone in his trench, cradling his empty mug, trying to burn this moment into his memory. The taste of tea, the cold air, the sound of distant generators, the knowledge that in 10 days, everything will change. He makes a promise to himself. No matter what happens in the coming battle, he'll have his tea. 4 times a day, regular as clockwork. Because Mackay's right. Tea is more than a beverage. It's a tether to the world he's fighting to preserve. October 23, 1942. 21:40 hours. British artillery positions, El Alamein. In 20 minutes, Operation Lightfoot will begin. Over 1,000 guns are trained on German and Italian positions, loaded and ready. The gunners stand by their weapons, making final adjustments, awaiting the order to fire. This barrage will be the largest in the history of the Desert War, announcing Britain's transition from defense to offense, from retreat to advance. And throughout the artillery parks, Crews are having a last cup of tea before the storm breaks. Captain Michael Mike Thornton, commanding a battery of 25-pounder guns, watches his men go through the ritual one more time. They know what's coming. The whole army knows. But the tea steadies them, roots them in the familiar even as they prepare for the unprecedented. At 21:58 hours, Thornton gives the order to mount up. Mugs are emptied, rinsed, stowed. Men take their positions at the guns, hands on lanyards, eyes on their officers. The desert holds its breath. At 10 p.m. hours precisely, the night explodes with light and sound. 1,000 guns firing simultaneously, shells screaming westward toward enemy positions, the beginning of a barrage that will last for hours and consume thousands of tons of ammunition. The Battle of El Alamein, the turning point of the North African campaign, has begun. And when dawn breaks on October 24th, when the infantry goes forward behind a curtain of steel, when the tanks roll through the minefields and into the breach, they'll do so knowing that in 6 hours, at 10 o'clock hours sharp, they'll stop for tea. Because that's what British soldiers do. Even especially on the day they begin to win the war. November 4th, 1942. West of El Alamein, pursuing Axis forces. The breakthrough came on the 4th day. Montgomery's infantry cracked the German defences, his armour poured through the gap, and now Rommel's Afrika Korps is in full retreat. The hunter has become the hunted, and the British Eighth Army is pursuing with a vengeance born of 2 years of defeats and retreats. Sergeant Major William Hawkins, the same Hawkins who held his position southwest of Tobruk 5 months earlier, is at the controls of a new tank now, his beloved Empress of India having been knocked out during the initial assault. His new mount is called Indomitable, a Sherman tank fresh from American factories, bigger and better armed than the Crusader. But the boiling vessel inside works exactly the same way. At 4 p.m. hours, his squadron commander orders a halt. They've been moving since dawn, covering nearly 40 miles, engaging German rearguards twice, pushing hard to keep pressure on the retreating enemy. The crews are exhausted, operating on adrenaline and determination. They need a break. All call signs, 30 minutes for replenishment and maintenance. Make it count. Hawkins doesn't need to tell his crew what to do. Trooper James Aldridge, still his gunner, still freckled, now sporting an impressive desert tan, has the BV switched on before Hawkins finishes dismounting. Within minutes, tea is brewing, and the crew is gathered in the shade of their tank's hull, passing around mugs. "We're winning," says Corporal Davies, the Welshman, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "We're actually bloody winning." "Don't jinx it," warns Sullivan, the loader, but he's grinning. They're all grinning. For the first time since any of them arrived in North Africa, the British Army is advancing, not retreating. It's a heady feeling, almost intoxicating. Hawkins sips his tea and watches the dust clouds to the West German vehicles pulling back, trying to create distance. He thinks about all the months of desert warfare, all the times they stopped for tea while being shot at, surrounded, outnumbered. The Italian soldiers who watched them with bewilderment. The German troops who learned to respect, if not understand, the peculiar British obsession. "Sergeant Major," Aldridge asks, "do you think the tea really made a difference?" Hawkins considers the question seriously. Made a difference to what? To winning. To us being here right now instead of them. The Shermans made a difference. Montgomery's planning made a difference. The supplies from America, the reinforcements from Britain, all of that made a difference. Hawkins pauses, drains his mug. But yeah, the tea made a difference too. Kept us human when everything else was trying to turn us into animals. Kept us British when we could have become something else. That matters in a long war. 500 yards away, a group of Italian soldier stragglers from a unit overrun during the breakthrough are being processed by British military police. One of them is Tenente Giacomo Marchetti, the same officer who watched British tea breaks with such bewilderment back in June. Marchetti is exhausted, defeated, relieved to be out of the fighting. As the MPs lead him and his men toward a collection point for prisoners, he passes a British tank where the crew is having tea. The scene is so familiar, so perfectly ordinary, that he almost laughs. Of course they're having tea. The British are winning the greatest battle of the Desert War, and they're having tea. One of the British soldiers, a young private with a kind face, notices Marchetti staring and offers him a mug. The gesture is against regulations, Probably, but the private doesn't seem to care. Marchetti accepts gratefully. The tea is too sweet, made the British way, but it's hot and wet and better than anything he's had in days. Grazy, he says. Thank you. The private nods, smiles, returns to his conversation with his mates. Marchetti sits on the ground, cradling his mug, thinking about all the times he watched British soldiers do exactly this. He understands now, in a way he couldn't before. The tea isn't about the beverage. It's about maintaining who you are when everything is trying to break you down. The British never lost that. His own forces did, gradually, worn down by the desert and the endless fighting and the growing certainty of defeat. It was the tea, he says aloud in Italian, not really expecting anyone to understand. But the private does. He studied languages at university before the war. It helps, he says in halting Italian. But it's really about having something normal, you know? Something that reminds you there's a world outside all this. Marchetti nods slowly. Yes. That's exactly what it is. December 12, 1942. Benghazi, Libya. The pursuit has carried the 8th Army back across all the ground they lost during Rommel's offensives, back through Tobruk liberated for the second time and west toward Tunisia. The Axis forces are being squeezed between Montgomery advancing from the east and the Americans and British advancing from the west after Operation Torch. The end in North Africa is beginning to come into focus. Private Edwin Walsh, the young man who wrote to his mother about tea back in March, is billeted in a house in Benghazi that still has most of its roof. It's the first time he's been indoors in 8 months. There's running water, occasionally. Electric lights, when the generators work. It feels impossibly luxurious. He's writing another letter home. Dear Mum, we're in Benghazi now, which you can probably find on a map. It's a proper city, not like the desert where we've been. There are buildings and streets and everything. Some of the locals are friendly, some aren't, most just want the fighting to move somewhere else. I'm still in Britannia, same tank, mostly the same crew, though we lost our driver at El Alamein and got a replacement. Nice lad from Cornwall named Peter. We've come hundreds of miles since I last wrote. Sometimes I can hardly believe it. For so long we were retreating, always falling back, always worried that Jerry would break through and that would be the end. Now we're the ones doing the pushing. And through it all, we had our tea. I know I go on about this, but it really does matter, Mum. During the big battle at El Alamein, when we were fighting through the minefields and getting shelled constantly, when half the lads I knew were getting killed or wounded, we still stopped for tea. 4 times a day, regular as clockwork. It was the only normal thing in a completely balmy situation. Some of the Italian prisoners we've taken, they talk about how strange it was watching us. They thought we were mad at first. Maybe we are, a bit. But I think it's the good kind of mad. The kind that keeps you sane when everything else is trying to drive you round the bend. The captain says we'll be in Tunisia by February, then Sicily or Italy or maybe straight to France. I don't know where we'll end up, but I know there'll be tea. That's enough for now. Walsh seals the letter, adds it to the stack going out with the next mail run. Outside, he can hear the sounds of an army and occupation vehicles moving, men shouting orders, the clatter of supplies being unloaded. And underneath it all, the familiar hiss of boiling vessels, dozens of them, as tank crews throughout Benghazi settle in for their evening tea. January 15, 1943. British 8th Army Mobile Headquarters, somewhere in Libya. Major Geoffrey Keating, recently promoted from his position at El Alamein, is briefing a group of war correspondents on the campaign. Among them is Margaret Burke-White, the American photographer who interviewed Corporal Barrett about tea back in 1941. She remembers that conversation, remembers thinking that the British tea obsession was a charming eccentricity. Now, having followed the 8th Army through the El Alamein offensive and the subsequent pursuit, she understands it differently. Major Keating, she asks during the question period, what would you say was the single most important factor in defeating Rommel? Keating considers the question. He could talk about Montgomery's leadership, or the Sherman tanks, or ultra-intelligence, or any number of tactical and strategic factors. But he decides to be honest. I'd say it was our ability to maintain routine under extreme stress. The Germans were superb soldiers, tactically brilliant, technologically advanced. The Italians were brave and often very competent. But they couldn't sustain operations the way we could. They'd fight brilliantly and then collapse from exhaustion. We learned to pace ourselves, to maintain our mental health through routine and ritual. Tea was a big part of that. Another correspondent, British, laughs. Surely you're not saying we won because of tea. I'm saying we won because we never stopped being British, even when being British seemed like a luxury we couldn't afford. Tea was part of that. So was shaving when we could, writing letters home, maintaining discipline even in retreat. The small things that separate civilization from barbarism. The Germans let the desert change them into desert fighters. We stayed British soldiers who happened to be fighting in the desert. In a long war of attrition, that made all the difference. Burke White writes this down, already planning the story she'll write. The tea angle is perfect for American audiences, quirky, very British, but with a deeper truth underneath. She's seen enough combat now to recognize genuine military innovation when she encounters it, even if that innovation involves tea kettles. After the briefing, she approaches Keating privately. The boiling vessel, she says. That was a deliberate design decision, wasn't it? Not just a nice addition, but an actual tactical consideration. Absolutely. The War Office studied the problem of crew fatigue in armored operations. They determined that the need to dismount for food and water preparation was causing unnecessary casualties and reducing combat effectiveness. The BV solved both problems. Crews could stay mounted during extended operations, maintain hydration and morale through regular hot beverages, and sustain combat effectiveness far longer than before. It's brilliant, Burke White says, and she means it. It's such a simple solution to a complex problem. Very British practical, slightly eccentric, and devastatingly effective. Keating smiles. We like to think so. May 13, 1943. Tunis, Tunisia. The North African campaign is over. The last Axis forces in Tunisia have surrendered. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers are now prisoners. Rommel himself was evacuated weeks ago, his Afrika Korps destroyed, his legend tarnished. The British, Americans, and Free French have won a complete and total victory. In the center of Tunis, tank crews from the British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, are celebrating. There's wine liberated from German stores, cheese from abandoned Italian supply dumps, cigarettes and laughter, and the sweet relief of men who've survived a campaign that killed so many of their friends. And there's tea. Sergeant Major William Hawkins stands beside Indomitable, his third tank of the campaign, and watches his crew prepare one final desert brew-up. They've been together for almost 2 years now, through defeats and retreats and finally victory. Aldridge, Davies, Sullivan, they become more than a crew, more than friends. They're brothers, bound by shared hardship and the peculiar rituals that kept them sane. Last desert tea, lads, Hawkins says, accepting his mug from Aldridge. Next time we do this, we'll be in Europe. Italy first, I reckon, Davies says. Then France. Maybe by Christmas. They all know it won't be that simple. Italy will be hard, a grinding campaign up a mountainous peninsula against German forces fighting on better ground. But they don't talk about that now. Now is for celebration, for relief, for tea. A jeep pulls up, and Captain James Anson, the same Anson who orchestrated a desperate breakout at Sidi Rezeg, dismounts and approaches. He's a major now, wearing the ribbon for the Distinguished Service Order earned during the El Alamein offensive. Hawkins, he says, returning the sergeant major's salute. Mind if I join you? Always room for you, sir. Anson accepts a mug, settles onto Indomitable's track guard. For a few minutes, they all sit in silence, drinking tea in the ruins of Tunis, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. The war isn't over, it's really just beginning, in many ways, but this chapter is closed. I was talking to some German prisoners this morning, Anson says eventually. Officers from the Afrika Korps. They wanted to know about the tea. Still baffled, are they? Sullivan asks. One of them said he'd figured it out. Said the tea wasn't really about the beverage, it was about demonstrating superiority. Showing the enemy that you're so confident, you can stop and have tea in the middle of a battle. Hawkins considers this his wrong, but not completely wrong. It wasn't about showing them anything. It was about showing ourselves. Proving to ourselves that we were still in control, still civilized, still British. The Germans saw it as arrogance. It was actually the opposite. It was us hanging on to our identity when everything else was trying to strip it away. Well, whatever it was, Anson says, raising his mug, it worked. To tea, gentlemen. And to surviving to drink it. To tea, they chorus, and drink. August 1943. London, England. In the War Office, a committee is reviewing lessons learned from the North African campaign. Among the many reports, studies, and analyses is one titled The Psychological Impact of Routine Maintenance on Combat Effectiveness, a study of tea consumption patterns in the Eighth Army. The report, written by a military psychiatrist who spent 8 months embedded with frontline units, makes several conclusions. 1. Regular scheduled breaks for hot beverage consumption significantly reduced rates of combat fatigue and psychological breakdown. 2. The installation of boiling vessels in armored vehicles increased sustained combat effectiveness by an estimated 12 to 15% through reduced crew fatigue and improved morale. 3. The maintenance of peacetime routines in wartime conditions contributed to superior unit cohesion and individual resilience compared to enemy forces who abandoned such practices. 4. Recommendation: maintain and expand the provision of tea and boiling vessels to all combat arms. Consider similar programs for other routine maintenance activities. The report is filed, circulated, and eventually incorporated into British military doctrine. The boiling vessel, initially viewed by many as an eccentric indulgence, becomes standard equipment in British armoured vehicles for the next 70 years. Future generations of soldiers will brew tea in tanks on the plains of Germany, in the deserts of Iraq, in the mountains of Afghanistan, never quite understanding why this particular tradition matters so much. But it does matter. It always has. October 24, 1943. 1 year after El Alamein. Private Bobby Shaw, the young Highland soldier who worried about the coming battle in his slit trenches, no longer in North Africa. His division is in Italy now, fighting in the mountains south of Naples. The terrain is completely different from the desert, but some things remain the same. 4 times a day, regular as clockwork, the men of the 51st Highland Division stop for tea. Shaw is alive, one of the lucky ones. Lance Corporal Mackay, the man who brought him tea that last night before El Alamein didn't make it through the battle. But his words stayed with Shaw. Tea is civilization. Tea is home. Tea is the promise that there's something better than this waiting for us. Shaw believes that now. He's seen enough, survived enough, to understand that the small rituals are what keep you human. The Germans and Italians fought brilliantly, but they fought as if war were the natural state of existence. The British fought as if war were an interruption of civilization, something to be endured and overcome, not embraced. The tea reminded them of that, every day, 4 times a day. As Shaw sits on a muddy Italian hillside, cradling his mug, watching rain clouds gather over Vesuvius, he thinks about all the men who shared this ritual. The ones who survived and the ones who didn't. The tankers and the infantry. The officers and the enlisted men. All of them stopping, in the middle of chaos and violence, to have a proper cup of tea. It was absurd. It was impractical. It was very, very British. And it worked. The Italian soldiers were right to be baffled. The Germans were right to be incredulous. Because from any rational military standpoint, stopping to brew tea in the middle of combat operations made no sense whatsoever. But war isn't entirely rational, and soldiers aren't machines. They're men who need reasons to keep fighting, who need reminders of what they're fighting for. For the British Army in North Africa, tea provided that reminder. It was a small thing, easily mocked, often misunderstood. But in the end, the men who stopped for tea were the ones who kept fighting. They were the ones who held El Alamein, who broke through at Alamein, who pursued across Libya and into Tunisia and won the Desert War. Not because of the tea, exactly. But not entirely despite it either. Shaw finishes his tea, rinses his mug, stows it carefully in his pack. Tomorrow there will be another battle, another hill to take, more friends to lose. But tomorrow at 10 o'clock hours, at 1 p.m. hours, at 4 p.m. hours, and at 7 p.m. hours, he'll stop and have his tea. Because that's what British soldiers do. And in a world gone mad with war, sometimes the sanest thing you can do is stop and have a cup of tea.